Let's talk about those bad kids. Let's talk about the adolescents who break the law. Let's talk about juvenile delinquents. All right, there is a big stereotype out there that adolescence is a time of rebellion. They can't wait to cause trouble. All right, and actually, we see that this is a faulty assumption. We actually see that many adolescents are not particularly likely to rebel, right? It's more of a stereotype and expectation than anything based on actual trends, actual behavior. We will talk about the ones who do, though. And, the idea of the out-of-control adolescence, it really doesn't hold up with observations, with real-world observations. Teenage acting out does happen, but it's not this thing that has to happen. Some people think that you don't have a normal youth if you don't have this big, rebellious acting out phase, and that's not necessarily true. There are plenty of adolescents out there. They're like, yeah, I'm fine just doing what I'm supposed to. I don't need to do that. All right, now, a big thing that we need to talk about is what happens when you get in trouble, when you break the law. And how common is this? How common is breaking the law? And when I teach in person, if I'm teaching in a classroom that has the capability of piping music into the classroom, and on my campus, most of the classrooms, the larger classrooms have that ability right now, I always like to play the Judas Priest song, breaking the law, breaking the law. And a lot of folks who are not as old as me, they're like, I think I've heard that song before. Does anybody know that song? And I'm like, oh, folks, you're making me feel old. It's the perfect song to play right before we discuss how common is it to break the law in adolescence. Well, the prevalence and incidence of criminal action is higher in adolescence compared to younger years and compared to adulthood too. But we have to talk about some key issues. First of all, if this was an in-person class, I'd say, let's remember what it means to break the law. There are lots of laws. I'll say, how many of you have ever broken the law? And a lot of people are like, oh no, I've never broken the law. I'm like, okay, folks, let's try again. How many of you drove before you had a driver's license? How many of you drank before you were 21? In the United States, legal drinking age is 21. I know a lot of people that drank before they were 21. How many of you have ever skipped class? And I'll just go through the list, and then eventually they're like, oh yeah, I did that too. I'm like, okay, so usually you end up with everybody or very close to everybody having your hand up. I'm like, all right, folks, we're all a bunch of delinquents. Accept it. There is a big difference between breaking the law and being caught and punished for breaking the law. And there are differences in who is likely to actually face consequences for breaking the law. Arrests are more likely with boys than girls. And, the sun is just, I don't know if you noticed that. It's like I'm bleached out now. I can't fix it either. Okay. Girls less likely than boys to get arrested, to get caught breaking the law. And there are some racial and ethnic and socioeconomic differences. All right, so if you're poor, if you're of a lower socioeconomic status, if you are certain racial minorities, particular black and brown individuals in the United States, you are significantly more likely to not just be arrested, but actually have consequences, and more severe consequences when you're members of those groups. And so sometimes the difference between having documented law breaking and not having documented law breaking, sometimes it's just a matter of luck. Sometimes you were just lucky that you did not get caught. Other times it's because, well, maybe the arresting officer said, oh, you seem like a good kid. I'm just gonna let you off with a warning. We don't have to document this. All right, so there are differences in terms of who actually faces consequences for their rule-breaking behavior. Now, another important difference is when we look at juvenile delinquents. Now, I know you've heard that term, but let's define that term. It's a legal term for a person under the age of 18, a minor, who breaks the law. All right, and importantly, they get caught breaking the law. All right, so this is someone who's in the legal system. They've got caught breaking the law, and they're a minor. They get labeled as a juvenile delinquent. Are all juvenile delinquents exactly the same in terms of their history and their likelihood of offending later? Absolutely not. There is diversity. And those who research delinquency have identified two basic types of delinquents. First of all, we have your life course persistent offender. Your life course persistent offender has had problems from very early on. Their criminal activity typically begins in childhood or early adolescence and continues throughout life. That is important. They do not stop their law breaking once they are an adult. They're essentially a career criminal. And so the life course persistent offender, they have a long history of problems. You know, they're the ones where you might have a story where the police had to come out to their home when they were very young because they were doing something, you know, something extreme. They were, you know, they got in a fight or they tried to steal from a neighbor or something like that. They're the ones who might have had to get pulled out of school for disruptive behavior. And sometimes they have been diagnosed with disruptive behavior disorders and other issues from very early on. Now, the other type of offender is the adolescence limited offender. All right. This is someone who gets caught in adolescence, they face consequences, but their criminal activity stops by age 21. They do not engage in criminal activity in adulthood. Which one do you think is more common? Life course persistent or adolescence limited offenders? Which one do you think is more common? The adolescence limited offender is more common. In fact, most people in the United States, most people in the juvenile justice system, the majority are first-time offenders and one-time offenders. The majority of folks in the juvenile justice system, they got caught and it's the only thing they do. And so when you think of juvenile delinquents, the majority are not necessarily, you know, career criminals, folks that, you know, they're on a path to a life of crime. A lot of times they are unlucky. They got caught. They didn't like the consequences, and so, you know, they don't engage in that same behavior in adulthood. The life course persistent offender, they've got a variety of risk factors. They do engage in, you know, longer, more persistent, more chronic problem behavior. They are less common than the adolescence limited offender. All right. That is the last video to go along with my chapter about social and emotional development in adolescence. All right, so the next videos are going to be about emerging adulthood. And you'll get to see that we have this unique little transition period between adolescence and adulthood.